to today's webinar sponsored by Bloom on common misconceptions about nutrient movement and availability in soil amendments. Just a reminder to please mute yourself throughout the presentation. We will have questions and answers at the end, so at any point you're welcome to just type in a comment or a question for the presenter, and we will we'll be addressing those at the conclusion of the presentation. We'll have probably 15 minutes or so for Q&A. And without further ado, I will introduce Ron. Ron Alexander is a horticulturalist and president of R. Alexander Associates, a consulting company specializing in product development for organic recycled products. He has over 35 years experience working with organic recycled products in the landscaping industry. He is an LACES registered trainer. He has written and presented over 500 papers, authored several state and national specifications. He was also the co-manager of the U.S. Composting Council's Seal of Testing Assurance Program, and he's worked extensively with Bloom, and so we're excited to bring him here today to talk to you about this important topic. Ron, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here. It is kind of a it's a very interesting, but it's a really important topic, and I will go I'll go right into it and share my screen. And there we go. Hope everybody can see that okay. I'm also going to turn off my, alrighty. So here's what we're going to be talking about. This is me. Yeah, I've been around since 1984. I did biosolids research back in school, worked with all sorts of recycled organic products. And thank you for DC Water and Blue Drop and Bloom to sponsor the event today. It's a pretty unique material. It's kind of a fun product to work with over the past several years, and quite an efficacious product, and also a product that they've sponsored great university research on. So here are our topics for today, and but I'll get right into it. I think as we all know, anybody who works in the soil or works with plants knows that, you know, we understand what nutrients are essential for plants. They're usually ranked by the amount of nutrients needed by the plant, and nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium are deemed as the most important nutrients, but really they're the nutrients that are needed by the plants the most. You know, we know what nitrogen deficient plants look like. They get yellow and they don't grow very well. But we're going to really focus on talking about nitrogen and phosphorus today for some obvious reasons. So there are concerns about the overuse of certain plant nutrients because they've been misused in the past, and there is potential environmental issues with over application, or the nutrients ending up not where they're supposed to be. But it is important to understand that we need plant nutrients if we're going to grow plants. We have to do that if we're going to grow food and fiber and food for animals. We need to apply nitrogen and phosphorus. Ornamental applications, if we want plants to properly establish, we need these nutrients. And of course, what's near and dear to me too is something around erosion control. And if we start hiding nutrients from certain plants like turf, turf covers start to die back, and we have a greater nutrient problem caused by soil erosion. But there are plant nutrients that are going to be used in agriculture and ornamental applications, and even these newer environmental applications in green infrastructure and erosion control. And these are applications where they're exposed to more water. So, but we have to grow plants because plants are part of the system. It is important to understand we're studying this topic more and more. We're learning more all the time. And one of the things we find out in many cases is when we add organic matter to the soil, sometimes these materials carrying nutrients, their ability to hold more water is one of the mechanisms to reduce migration from a site. So the future is not going to be not using nutrients, although I'm sure that there are going to be certain places that we're not going to be able to grow crops on going into the future, I'm sure. But sensible nutrient management and better soil management are really, really keys to moving forward. We can't ignore the fact that eutrophication is real. We have major problems in the U.S. There's a huge hotspot in the Gulf where the addition of excess nutrients cause nitrogen depletion, which kills plants, which kills fishes. So it's real. Closer to home, and obviously in the Chesapeake Bay, we've been studying this issue for years, and we've been working. Regulators have been working to help reduce nutrient migrations into the Chesapeake Bay. Research that's been done has shown that the major culprit is in agriculture. So we have to be smart in agriculture to reduce nutrient drift. But it's a really, really complicated issue. We've been studying nitrogen for a long time. There's been a regulatory focus on it for a long time. You know, we're not supposed to apply more nitrogen than a plant needs. We can put higher application rates when they're in slower release form. And we even have studied these mineralization rates of nitrogen in fertilizer products, in carbon-based products like compost and biosolids, and a lot of the work actually originated right in Beltsville, Maryland. We used to study phosphorus. Phosphorus went off of the radar for a while, and it's been back for quite a while now, but it's a really complicated issue. And it's complicated because phosphorus is tied up in soils much more aggressively, typically, than nitrogen is. I would also argue that the phosphorus problem is a series of problems, not just a simple issue of, hey, we're putting too much of this stuff down. A major problem has been over-manuring with CAFOs across the country, and of course we have them in the Chesapeake area. There have been places like in Florida where they have sandy soils and they put excess nitrogen and phosphorus down. Nitrogen has been a big culprit down there. And I would also argue that one of the huge problems that we don't talk about enough is soil erosion. We have federal law. States and cities and counties are supposed to be monitoring and aggressively enforcing the MPDS Phase 2 regulations. They don't typically do that, and that is a major issue. Are nutrients and compost and biosolids and fertilizer going onto lawns something that we should be watching? Sure, they are, but I would argue that they're not the main problem here, or concern, I should say, really. So one of the things we know about nitrogen and phosphorus nutrient movement is that soil conditions matter. You know, sandy soils tend to lose nutrients. They have lower cation exchange capacities. We'll get into that in a minute. But soil texture really matters. Okay, so it's always important that we have to go back and we have to reiterate that whether it's a landscape job or an agriculture, we must continue the soil test, and we have to soil test more and better. We get lazy with that, and it's a very, very important thing. And we'll get into some of the issues with testing in a second, but it is important because good test results will give us help us deal with problematic soil conditions and help us grow plants better and prescribe remedies. Our goal here is one of the things that we can do to reduce nutrient movement and have more nutrients go to plants is to improve soil functionality. And soil has very, very important functions to the plant. It helps plants stand up straight so they can photosynthesize, certainly. But it's also a medium for microbes. Those microbes live on the plant roots. They live symbiotically with the plants. It also acts as a repository for plant nutrients. and water, and it also can help reduce runoff. So several soil functions really affect nutrient availability, movement, and loss. It's not just what we put down, it's managing that soil. Soils that are finer textures, as many of us know, or where organic matter has been applied to the soil, we can increase the cation exchange capacity, the amount of negative charges. Most plant nutrients are positively charged, most. So the ability to increase cation exchange is a big way that we can reduce nutrient movement. That's typically done, again, by the addition of organic matter in a lot of landscape applications, especially in sandy soils. It should be noticed also that within organic matter that there are humic substances that even have a heightened ability to supply cation exchange or have a higher cation exchange. And we're starting to test these materials now for humic substances, and there is a link between the amount of humic substances and the cation exchange. So we're studying this more, and it's an important thing because we want to keep the nutrients in the plant's root zones. Research with erosion, there's been really great compost research done showing that the ability, even though there are soil amendments which are being used more, not just straight nutrients, but soil amendments that carry nutrients, the ability to improve the soil structure, to improve percolation, acceptance of rainwater, and also holding that water also is a mechanism for keeping nutrients in the root zone, reducing things like runoff and other things like that. Here's just an example of that, basically just showing we're adding 10 and 20% of, in this case, it's bloom to both clay and sandy soils, just showing that we hold more water and we're able to perk more water, which is basically also a means of showing that we're accepting more water into the soil. So again, this is a benefit, and it's something that we shouldn't look past. It's also important to know when we get carbon into the soil, we have a good, healthy soil, we have an improved biology. The microbes are going to help cycle nutrients to the plant. A lot of different mechanisms for that, but they also help us create large pore spaces, which helps us control that moisture loss through runoff, helping infiltration rate. So how did we get into this major topic? Nutrients are important, but the topic of nutrients are a problem. Well, historically, there have been places where we have over-applied quote unquote waste materials, manures, in some cases biosolids, and the issue here is in certain cases these materials have been applied at rates to supply the the plant's annual nitrogen requirement. And innately, when we do that, we add excess phosphorus because a lot of these recycled materials have a shallower nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. So when we put too much if we try to give the plant all the N that it needs with some of these materials, we innately add too much phosphorus. There are certain places around the country where, of course, that they have applied too much nitrogen, and it is nitrate nitrogen is negatively charged, so it doesn't stick onto things with cation exchange readily, so it's more mobile. So that can be a concern. A lot of ammonia-based fertilizers, they're released just through rainfall. They basically go into solution, and then they either sit in the soil or they run. When it comes to phosphorus, we know that when we apply phosphorus, it's readily tied up into fine textured soils. And because of that, the plants don't always get the phosphorus, the amount that they need, so we over apply it. And we've done that in many circumstances around the country. Unlike nitrogen, when we put too much phosphorus into the soil, it typically does not cause harm to the plant. Plants typically can survive with luxury amounts of phosphorus being in the soil. And there are lots of sites, especially near these CAFOs where manures are being applied, where the soils already have more more phosphorus than are needed to maximize plant yields. There are lots of different ways nutrients can get to the soil. We have inorganic nutrients that dominate the market, of course, and they're tracked quite well through states. There's also things like biosolids and manure products, so-called organic waste. They're actually incredibly efficacious materials, and of course you make composts and other products like bloom out of these materials. And lots of times these products are not registered with state departments of ag. Actually, unmanipulated manure is exempt from any fertilizer regulation, and in many cases, the organizations that manage a nutrient regulation often ignore certain materials like biosolids. So I think into the future, we're going to be managing the movement of the sale of nutrients in different forms better than we do today. But today, basically, some sources are tracked better than others. It is important to know that we are using these recycled organic-based soil amendments more than we did before. Where I grew up in the Mid-Atlantic area, where you guys are, peat moss was a big thing. In the South where I live now, it was pine bark for fixing these fine soils, and they really didn't carry nutrients, Then the compost industry came along and more modification of manure products, and the industry started to use more and more of these recycled organics for their carbon content primarily, but they carry nutrients. And different types of feedstocks carry different volumes of nutrients and different types of nutrients. If you look at the picture off to the left, there's a biosolids product right there. You can see, aside from really nice turf growth, really deep green because of nitrogen and iron in the material. And again, this is just another example showing the more of these soil amendments you add, well, first of all, you do increase cation exchange capacity, which is great because along with the organic matter, you'll hold more of those nutrients, but you increase both nitrogen and phosphorus and any other nutrients in that mix. So we know this happens. However, it is important to understand that, different soil amendments react differently in the soil. Okay. These materials have different carbon to nitrogen ratios. They contain different forms of nitrogen. A good example is fresh manure versus composted or aged manure. Fresh manure is very, very high in ammonia, and if you use that at too high of rates, you can burn crops. That same material, if you compost it properly, that ammonia-based nitrogen will be converted to organic nitrogen, and it'll be less problematic to the plants because it has to be mineralized through microbial activity to become nitrate again and be available to the plant. It's also important to know that the carbon to nitrogen ratio is important. A lot of these materials, again, bring carbon with them. And the products that have a shallow carbon to nitrogen ratio, like you see here on the bottom left, they're higher in nitrogen. Well, they supply more nitrogen to the system, and because they don't carry as much carbon, more of that nitrogen could be available to the plant. In some cases, these products are really high in ammoniacal nitrogen, which means the loss of nitrogen can also be higher. But it is interesting to know that the lower carbon to nitrogen ratio soil amendments, they can be low because they actually carry a lot of nitrogen, or they can be lower because they've been composted or aged and stabilized. And as the carbon starts breaking down, the microbes use the nitrogen to break down the carbon, and it again converts that nitrogen into slower release sources. So it is important to understand that all part of this understanding of how these nutrients, especially nitrogen, are going to get to the plant. A lot has to do with the carbon content and how fresh that carbon is. But the organic matter itself provides an immense amount of plant and soil benefits. Again, several things here like moisture management and nutrient cycling are affected in the soil by the addition of carbon. And we know one of the things moving forward is by creating healthier soils, we will have the ability to have better plant growth and actually help control nutrient movement from the sites and protect the environment. So pushing forward for the soil health movement is a big deal. USDA is promoting it for many, many reasons, but the key is to conserve nutrients, to conserve organic matter, to conserve soil quality. And that means feeding us, right? It means feeding us, and it also means helping to mitigate climate change. And again, I won't go into these things. There's a lot of environmental drivers for why we need to do this. So one of the reasons I bring this up is because the concept of using these recycled materials, these soil amendments that carry nutrients, is a really important thing moving forward. We have to figure out a way to put more carbon into the soil, and preferably carbon that's bringing a nice suite of microbes with it. But nutrients are going to come with that material. But healthy soils can be built with these organic soil amendments. We're looking at soil amendments differently today than we did years ago. We're not just talking about them improving the soil physically. This is AAPFCO, which is the Association of American Plant Food Control Officials, their definition, which came out over 10 years ago now. And we talk about using soil amendments to improve the physical, chemical, and biochemical and biological characteristics of the soil. So we understand it's more than just physical benefits going on here. Now, it's going to be those organic matter-based soil amendments that are going to provide more of the biologic benefits and things, because the mineral-based benefits are things that are going to create pore spacing and things like that. But not only are they heavier and more expensive, but they don't really help with biologic activity. They're not great. Now, if you add, clay to the soil, that's one thing. But really, what's going to happen as we move forward, aside from some very specific landscape applications, is it's these organic matter-based soil amendments that are going to continue to be used in force. And there's lots of different types of these wonderful brown products, but you can see here on the bottom that there are going to be some bioretention mixes and things, and rooftop mixes made with aggregates and sand, of course. But going back to these organic recycled products, they are plentiful. They're available pretty much everywhere around the country now. And again, aside from just improving the soil structurally, they help the soils biologically and with nutrients. So it complicates the discussion, because whenever we talk about using these materials, we get nutrients. They're typically available in slow release form, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. Potash is much more available out of these materials. And they come along with that carbon and that ability to keep those nutrients in place a little bit. However, in saying that, there's much more focus at looking at these soil amendments that carry nutrients with them. But it is important to understand, again, that a lot of the nutrients in these materials are in very, very stable form. And the same nutrients that get to plants are the same nutrients that can be mobile and impact the environment. So, when we talk about what's plant available, well, what's plant available is more available to the environment at large. So when these materials go into solution, they become available to the plants. But we're starting to study this and understanding this more. right? So soil testing, again, is important, as is testing for plants to understand, are the plants getting the nutrients that they need? Should I really be applying another dose of fertility? Or should I just, hey, I tested the plant parts or the available nutrients in the soil solution, and no, don't apply right now. Wait until the plant needs it. And it is important that testing with the proper test methods is a key attribute or a key point when it comes to the use of these materials and really understanding nutrient movement. Here is a great example. Here is a farm field where the Bloom product was applied. And if you look over to the right, the Bloom has, this shows, in this case, 2% phosphorus on an as-is basis as P2O5, which is a significant amount of phosphorus, okay? It's applied at 10 tons per acre. But look at if you look at this, this is done through the testing the soil with the MELIC 3 soil testing test method. The amount of phosphorus that is in solution and available is low. And that's because along with that along with the nutrients are carbon, of course, but in that carbon are iron and aluminum, and that helps the phosphorus bind to the soil, so it takes a much longer time, years, for microbes to be able to break those nutrients free and allow them to go into solution. So in a case like this, there's not going to be a lot of phosphorus, percolation and runoff. The main thing you need to do on a farm field like this is make sure you're not eroding. You're not eroding soil, right? Okay, so as we've gotten deeper into this, there are new test methods out there now for testing that were created for measuring phosphorus availability, because we have a much better understanding of nitrogen movement and availability than we have for phosphorus. And there are now naturally used tests for looking at nutrients coming out of these carbon-based products. And the key aspect of this is because we can now test these materials and understand what percent of slow release phosphorus, as well as we're already testing them for slow release nitrogen or organic nitrogen, right? And they're typically gonna cycle out over a 3-year period, typically, with these recycled organics. But this water extractable phosphorus number also gives us a better idea of how much this is going to be available. Now, it is important to understand that the state control officials who govern the sale of nutrients now accept the use of this test method to be able to make claims of slow release phosphorus from these materials. So this will be a key moving forward as you start purchasing and using these materials to make sure that water extractability tests are done, to perhaps test for the full suite of nitrogen to understand how much ammonia and nitrate nitrogen is available. They're more mobile forms of nitrogen, of course. And then there's how much organic nitrogen is available. And remember, nitrate and orthophosphorus, which is the form that most plants get phosphorus from, it goes into solution faster. Of course, they're negatively charged. And we're adding negative charges through organic matter, so that increased cation exchange capacity doesn't help us much there. But again, we'll get into how some of these things become free in a minute. It is important to understand that when you look at the soil, there are lots of ways that nitrogen is balanced in the soil. There's lots of ways nitrogen is added to the soil. Some of it comes from the sky, believe it or not, from rain, but a lot of it and some of it is added through crop residue and manure and and fixing soils with compost and bloom and things like that. But it's also lost, of course, through leaching, some through volatilization, actually, when you add some of these materials to the soil surface, and through erosion, of course, and through crop removal. So there's lots of mechanisms for nutrients coming into the soil and leaving the soil. And again, soil management practices of the plants affect the loss of nitrogen and the loss of phosphorus. Remember, the loss of nitrogen and phosphorus is always going to be something we have to watch more closely with coarser soils, because they will volatilize things like nitrogen more easily because they have a low cation exchange, and they'll also leach more nutrients that go into solution because they have large pore spaces, right? And there's more gravitational water pulling the water through these coarse soils. So, you know, back in the old days, we looked at chemical fertility, and this is what we used to say, well, the plants get 45 to 75% of the nutrients and 0 to 10% leach out. I remember when I was in school looking at this book and looking at this in the early 80s saying, okay, well, now I look at it many years later and I say, I really don't believe this pie chart at all. I don't. I think that there's much more lost of inorganic nutrients because the way we use mobile commercial fertility. It's one of the reasons why you see a lot of landscape and turf people going to slower release forms. They're concerned about loss. And also by putting slower release but more expensive forms of nutrients down, you don't have to fertilize as much. And there's staffing power that you have to consider when you consider how much nutrients it costs to put nutrients down. So here's a good example of that. Look at this graph. On the bottom, you can see here's different two forms of urea, which is very high in ammoniacal nitrogen, very quick release. You throw that water on that, it's going to become very mobile. But when you coat it with a different type of coating, sometimes they do sulfur. You slow the release of that nitrogen because you put a physical barrier that breaks down over time. Where you use just urea and you have no physical barrier, the percent release is way up high. And that adds a lot of risk, not only to plant burning if you use too much, but the migration of nutrients, right? So that's one of the reasons why we look closer in many applications to using slower release nutrients. The nutrients that are considered more organically bound, they're typically attached to, they're attached to organic matter. As microbes start breaking them down through mineralization, they become nitrate forms again. They become available to the plant. The interesting aspect of this natural, very natural mechanism, this is a mother nature's mechanism, of course, is that when a lot of these microbes are active, it's when plants are active. So some of these materials, these recycled organic materials that you put into the soil, in many conditions, the nutrients are not going to become available until the soil starts waking up and the microbes start mineralizing, especially that nitrogen, and making it more plant available. So here's an example of basically a composted and uncomposted biosolids. And what you find out here is the uncomposted material, because it's higher in ammonia again. Look, there's much more ammonia available. Okay, when you compost it, you shrink the CN ratio. You now convert that ammonia-based nitrogen to organic nitrogen. It's much less available, and it's slower. It's slower to be absorbed by the plant, but of course it also has less of a tendency to run off. Research done right there in Beltsville, Maryland, showed that there's quite a low mineralization rate with certain compost products. Realistically, these rates that you see in this box is 10% the first year, and then it's basically halved for 2 more years. There's data out there showing these numbers are doubled. In the Middle Atlantic area, you may get 20% the first year, and in certain places in the Deep South, you may get more nitrogen than that. But this is a nitrogen mineralization thing, but it has to do with plant temperatures, and those temperatures relate to microbial activity. And usually that's one of the things that regional extension service people have a decent idea of what mineralization rates are going to be for nitrogen. Understand again, there has been good research done, even when nitrogen-based products, or I should say soil amendments, compost, and other things are applied at very high application rates that we really don't want to do. There's all this research out there applying compost and biosolids for the nitrogen rate needed by the plant. Well, we know that we really don't want to do that. But in many cases, when we do that, for instance here, you can see even at 25 and 50 tons per acre with these two carbon-based products that supply a real decent amount of nitrate nitrogen, there's very, very little nitrate runoff compared to the control, to the chemical nitrogen. And that's again because it's in slower release form. A more local example, a work that was done by Greg Avanilo. I saw him from Virginia Tech. He's on the call. He knows 10 times more about this than I do, and many other people do. And but again, they've actually done trials where they have applied these types of materials for 5 years in a row at the annual nitrogen rate, which are really, really high rates, which we're really not going to do in the real world. And what they found in this research, again, with products like Bloom and certain other biosolids-based products that are high in iron, the idea of phosphorus running off, it's not nearly what people think it is. There's much lower ability for that phosphorus to move. So it's going to take several years. I've heard numbers 5 years, maybe even longer, for some of those nutrients to cycle back out to the plants. And of course, both phosphorus and nitrogen could end up in microbes also. And there's been also research done by the University of Maryland for the State Highway Association, staying just in a 2-year application here. Here's a 2-year application applying the product. I apologize too. This last application was applying nitrogen at I think it was at nitrogen annual nitrogen rates, but they track the phosphorus. In this case, this University of Maryland study, it basically looked at just the nitrogen movement. And one of the things it shows is, the plants are growing really well. They're getting the plant nutrients, but as important, it's fixing the soil and it's moderating water movement. Remember, the tricky thing with phosphorus is that phosphorus is most available in soils when the pH is neutral. When there's low pH, it binds very, very easily to aluminum and to iron, and in higher alkaline soils, it binds to calcium. Remember that the phosphorus that gets to the plant and the phosphorus that's available for migration is only the dissolved phosphorus, okay? And that dissolving of that phosphorus takes time. It does not happen all at once, which is one of these reasons why I talk about the importance of soil erosion. A lot of what we have to do is really take soil erosion seriously if we're going to look to manage nutrients in different types of applications. Here's some really interesting work looking at these carbon-based products again, comparing them to chemical phosphorus here. And what you can see here, here's a biosolids-based fertilizer, 2% water extractable phosphorus. Different types of other products are between 5 and 25% water extractable phosphorus. Manures have more water extractable phosphorus, but it's always the chemical P that has the greatest risk of migration and environmental risk. I got involved in looking at this closely because of some work done with compost by a client and a friend of mine, testing all different compost products and showing that only between 2 and 22% phosphorus, water extractable phosphorus, was available or water extractable the first year from a compost product. Yet in certain areas, certain states, they're making it so we couldn't even top dress turf with compost because of the innate nutrients in it. And I think this is problematic. I think that we have to look more seriously at the movement of those nutrients. And this is just another trial, but I do want to show you something here, that there are different types of carbon-based products here that have been tested aside from fertilizer here. This OCB is a dried pelletized product. Then there's bloom, and then there's bloom mixed with woody material. This LBC is a compost, which is not high in iron. And what you notice here, the use of that at the nitrogen, the annual nitrogen rate again, there's much more nitrogen available, or I'm sorry, much more phosphorus that's available and goes into the solution. So using that material at higher rates, there's a greater risk of phosphorus movement, right? But notice that some of these other products, this Bloom 5, which is applied at 5 times the annual rate, and the Bloom mixed with a bark, you still notice that because of the high aluminum and iron content, the phosphorus availability, even at those really extreme rates, which we would not do in the real world, is still lower than that rate that's available through fertility. So this concept of what happens with chemical nutrient-based reactions into the soil is really, really an important thing. And I think sometimes I think what's going to happen in time, I think nutrient application is going to have a tendency to need to get more complicated. We have to we have to not look like the sky is falling with some of these things. We're going to have to get smarter in the way we apply these things and use these things, especially if we're going to feed ourselves. And I just want to mention, I'm almost near here in the end, that again, state officials now, and it's a state-by-state thing, are now allowing us to test materials and claim slow-release phosphorus on them, like you see here on the label, where we can actually test with the water extractability test. And I think that goes right in line to more and more research that's being done by agricultural scientists, which they're trying to look at phosphorus application when it comes to manure and fertilizer and other materials based on the availability of the nutrients, as you can see down here to the far right, the bottom right, as well as the orientation of the soil and the type of soil there is. So I think instead of dumbing down the discussion going into the future, I think it's going to get more complicated, and people may not like that, but I really think it's going to probably be necessary for us to get better at this and more scientific at this to make sure we can grow the plants we need. We need the carbon in the soil, but also to basically protect water. So just some areas of advice, and I'll get off here so we can get into some questions. I apologize. It is important. Things that we can do to reduce nutrient migration is to consider the use of products that have lower, slow release forms of nitrogen and phosphorus in them when it's possible to use them. We always have to be more cautious in the way we apply fertility in sandier soils because there's more possibility for leaching. It is important to understand the pH and the organic matter content, and then things, the calcium and iron and phosphorus in the soil, because that will help govern nutrient availability and potential mobility, right? It is important also if we can, especially in the finer soils, if we can incorporate these nutrients into the soil before we get heavy rains, more of the nutrients will attach to soil, we'll lose less through runoff. And it is important that when we use some of these soil amendments which carry nutrients, that we're smart about any additional nutrients we apply, that we cut back chemical nutrition, knowing that making an estimate of how much of these materials are going to be mineralized or plant available. And in some cases, it's going to be the best guess. Okay, that's okay. Reducing erosion is an important thing. And of course, vegetating the site is important. So the final takeaways are, when we look at nutrient movement, not only does the input matter, the type of material we're applying, what form the nitrogen and phosphorus are in, but is it being applied bound to carbon and other nutrients that are in the carbon? Is it being applied with something that actually holds more water on site? I think that these are important questions to ask, that we have to figure out ways to work into our nutrient management plans. And I'm hoping that regulators will move along with this new information, and will take a longer term view of the use of some of these materials. Again, it is very, very important for us to get carbon into the soil for climate change reasons alone. And in some of these, actually the more plentiful and less costly products, they carry, a lot of these materials carry nutrients with them. So thank you again for your time, for listening, and look forward to your questions. Thanks again.
Great, thank you so much, Ron. We do have a few questions. Let's see. Christian wanted to know your thoughts on ammonia to nitrate conversion and movement over the winter from organic amendments land applied in the fall winter in cool climates.
Yeah, I think that there's actually data out there showing that, there's not a lot of nitrogen loss with these types of materials. Most compost products have the nitrogen is 90 to 95% in organic form. So when the soil sleeps, the microbes sleeps, and the nutrients typically aren't moving.
Okay.
It's an important question.
Yeah, absolutely, especially for our work. I think we just needed a clarification of terms. You occasionally referred to chemical P, and we were thinking you were referring to inorganic versus organic forms of phosphorus. Maybe if you could just clarify terms.
Yeah, well, so even the phosphorus in there are, when I sometimes talk about chemical P, I talk about something that's being applied in a fertilizer granule. Okay, so fertilizer rock is the phosphorus rock. The phosphorus in that has got very poor mobility. So like people who buy organic forms of phosphorus, like phosphorus rock for organic farming, it is very hard to get phosphorus. Well, what the chemical fertilizer industry has done is added acids and electrical current to these rocks, and then they create a new form of phosphorus, which is more concentrated and is much less bound. So I talk about those materials versus the ones that are coming along with carbon, and the things in carbon that help slow it down, slow its movement down. So I hope that helps. But it is important to note that the nitrogen, the phosphorus in things like bloom, biosolids, and phosphorus are actually in inorganic form, believe it or not. They're just bound.
Okay, I'm going to keep rolling. Question from Lorna. When surface applying lime stabilized biosolids onto soils that test with calcium levels at 4,200 parts per million pre-application, do you feel then that phosphorus contained in our biosolids largely wouldn't be available? Is she understanding that correctly?
I don't think I have enough information to answer that question. I mean, if the soil pH, is high, less phosphorus is available, but I don't really know what the 42 number means when it comes to phosphorus. So maybe we could talk after the fact about this, and I can look at some of the data if they want to reach out to me.
Okay. Someone wants to know what the phosphorus saturation index is.
That was from that slide I showed, I believe. Well, I think the saturation. I don't know if I can give a very plain answer for that, so I have to come back to it instead of trying to wing it. I'll put something in the chat, and I bet you if Greg Avanilou's on there, he'll put something in the chat for me before I can even do it.
Someone wants to know if you have discussed with MDE straight P versus WEP phosphorus. With
MDE, I believe that there have been some opening conversations. I know that when it comes to bloom, we've talked to nutrient managers. We've showed them the data. We actually were trying to do some additional research with University of Maryland, but we've not been able to find a grad student to do that. But I would say that there have not been detailed discussions when it comes to that at this point.
Question from Greg Osbin. What recipe would you recommend to increase the fertility of some of our high sand or rapidly percolating soils? In other words, bioretention or sand-based structural soils?
Yeah, that's really, really a hard question because I work with these materials all over the country. A lot of the mixes are straight sand and compost. There are other places where they put a percentage, 10 or 20% soil into the mix. One of the things that is typically done as a starting point to slow the water is to go, instead of going straight sand, 60, 70, 80% of the mix, they'll often do a part of that as a sandy loam soil. So there is a small component of finer particles along typically with compost going on with that, going in with that. That would be the first place I think to start.
Question, how important is K in comparison to N and P?
Well, it's a very, very, it's one of the top 6, it's one of the top 6 most important nutrients, or some people would say it's in the top 3, but there aren't real sensitive environmental issues to the use of phosphorus. The interesting part about, to potash. The interesting thing about potash is I've used a lot of these recycled organics in the fall in turf applications and found really great response. And back in the day, in the 80s, when I did that, I didn't understand what was happening. And up north, this was up in Pennsylvania, I did not realize that the potash in these products was 80 to 90% available the first year. And it's also a very, very important overwintering nutrient for a lot of plants. So it helps plants overwinter without damage. So the idea of applying some of these materials in the fall is quite interesting in certain applications because you may be giving it some potash, which will help it overwinter without dieback. So it's kind of fascinating, but not big environmental risk there.
Greg Avanlo did chirp in here saying the P index is a tool that quantifies P last risk based on phosphorus solubility and transport risk. P source
There you go.
coefficient is a parameter in the P index that quantifies soluble P contribution to P loss risk.
So there you go. And this is what the agricultural scientists have been trying to bring to this discussion, that it's much more complicated, and they're creating a method in which that you can really rate sites to better understand how much nutrients can be applied. And I just hope that in more states and in more areas, this becomes the regulation. This is what's used moving forward.
And he also followed that up saying that that P solubility in organic byproduct is only a partial contributing factor to P loss from soil. Resulting P soil interactions are subsequently more important.
There you go. Again, much bigger brain.
Someone asked the author for the article "Phosphorus Compost Dynamics." I believe that's you, right, Ron?
That is me. That is me, and yeah, and there is.
Is there a link for that? Is that something that people can find online?
Well, they can just go to my website. I've already put on the chat that my website address if people want to go to it. It's www.alexasos.net. And there's a couple other papers. There's a new paper because the slow release phosphorus has been approved. It was just approved early in February by the state fertilizer control officials to make slow release phosphorus claims. There's an article on there too.
Great. Well, I think that covers all the questions we had. I didn't properly introduce myself at the beginning. I'm April Thompson, obviously, but I am the Director of Marketing and Sales for Bloom. I know some of you all here know us well, and some of you, this may be your first time learning about Bloom. If you have any questions about us, or want to follow up, my email is april@bloomsoil.com, or else you can also reach out to bloom@bloomsoil.com. We will be sending out a link to the recording after the fact, and I think you'll have Ron's information along with that too if you need to reach out to him specifically. And yeah, I just really appreciate everyone coming out today to hear our presentation, and for Ron for sharing your knowledge as usual. It's like a very important topic. And
thank you for that. And I have to give kudos to Blue Drop and DC Water. They're producing a very good product, a very interesting product, but they're also investing in the research. And it's a great thing to see, because there's not great investment in research anymore, and they're doing a great job with that. So thank you, everybody. If anybody wants to shoot out, you see my email on there too, but my website does have information, and I'm sure April can answer a lot of the questions too. So thanks again.
Great. Enjoy your afternoon, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.